Good morrow, nerds. It is I. Tabletop RPGs first emerged as an outgrowth of wargames, and combat has been an important part of them ever since. But how important should it be, and how long should it take? That's the question we'll be answering in this video. But before we rush into that topic, I have 3 buttons that I'd love it if you'd click, and those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. So if we want to explore how long combat should take, we need to actually quickly go through what happens in a typical tabletop RPG combat. Everything starts with determining initiative. Normally, this is done by a die roll, usually once at the start of combat, but there are variations. Cyberpunk 2020 has you roll initiative every single round, while Call of Cthulhu has fixed initiative. You go on your dexterity score, that's it. There is the exception for going on your dexterity plus 50 if you're using a firearm as the first action on your turn, but the point is that you don't roll. Once you've established who's going first, you then take turns. And on your turn, it starts with the GM summoning you to actually do something, then you deciding what to do, the GM ruling on how you do it, what you need to roll, you then rolling that, and perhaps the GM rolling against you, at which point the turn ends with the GM and sometimes the player narrating the outcomes. You repeat this once for each player in the combat, going through initiative order, until everybody has gone. At this point, you repeat the round structure over and over until the combat ends. Some RPGs have rules for enemies running out of morale and surrendering, but in most cases, RPG combat is to the death, no matter how unrealistic that may be. But within this structure, what are the actual parts that make RPG combat take as long as it does? The first and most fundamental of these is the number of combatants, both PC and NPC. Until someone invents a system where having more players makes the individual turns shorter, having more turns in the combat will just simply take more time. That's just how arithmetic works. The next step along is people taking time to figure out what the hell they're doing. Some of this can be like a focus, players not immediately responding to their character being called out for their turn, but it can also be things like indecision, checking up on rules, and debating tactics with the rest of the players. All of this stuff takes time, and the more of it you do, the longer it'll take. This neatly dovetails into the effect of distraction. This can be anything from players being on their phones and not noticing what's going on, to table chatter, to, oh, a cool bird at the window, and everyone looking at the window. That specific example has never happened to me before, but you do get my point. But even if players are being perfectly focused, there is still potentially a lot to get through on their turn, and really this comes down to how generous the action economy is. Cyberpunk Red has the most restrictive action limits that I've seen in any RPG. You get 1 action and 1 move each turn, and that's it. There are no reactions, only held actions, and even then held actions aren't super useful. In D&D 5e, on the other hand, you get an action, a bonus action, a move action, a free object interaction, and a reaction. Although there are further caveats to this. Most classes don't have a use for their bonus action, and the amount you can do with an action can vary wildly, often based on the number of attacks your class is allowed. Pathfinder 2e uses a far more streamlined system. You get 3 actions and 1 reaction. Some things take 1 action, some take 2, some take 3, some are free actions. But while you can potentially be doing as many as 4 things in a round, you can also find yourself doing only the 1. Which of those cases you find yourself in will determine how long your turn takes. Yet, figuring out your actions is barely the half of it. The complexity of the rule set will also play a pivotal role in how long combat takes. If you have to roll hit location every time you make an attack, that would make combat take longer. Likewise, if your character has a whole bunch of special abilities that you can't remember the rules to, that you have to keep looking up, again, that will slow down combat. And finally, last but not least, there is narrative and description. The more time and effort that the GM and the players put into describing their actions, role-playing out everything, the slower combat is going to be. Although, as we'll see, this is one place where a lot of people are very happy to take their time with combat. But why does any of this matter? Why should you care how short or long your combat is? First, especially the length of rounds has a huge impact on player engagement. The shorter a round is, the sooner your turn is, the more often you get to act, and the less time you spend waiting around. This is why, when I did my statistical analysis of the MCDM RPG's combat system, rather than trying to subjectively assess how much fun I thought the players were having, which to be fair was quite a bit, I tried to make an objective analysis of how long their turns were taking to get a sense of what player engagement would be like. Next, the actual length of a combat has a huge impact on the pacing of a session or a campaign. If you're going through a dungeon at the pace of one combat a session, things are going to grind to a halt. On the other hand, if you can get through every combat in a mini dungeon in one session, well, now we're talking. But short and long combats also have their own unique ups and downs that we'll get to very soon. Short combats, while they are good for pacing, they can feel anticlimactic if you're meant to have a big dramatic boss fight. Long combats, for their part, while they can be very tactical, they can also be very, very, very boring. And so to actually get the right feel for your combat and to actually have it be fun, you need to get the timing just right. As we're discussing this topic, I'd like to take a moment to actually discuss what a long or a short combat even is, because that can be a bit nebulous. In my opinion, there are three basic ways to measure the length of a combat. The first is absolute time. How many hours, minutes, and seconds it takes from first roll of initiative to the end of the final turn. This is loosely correlated with how long combat takes in character, but only loosely. Personally, I'd say that anything under half an hour is short, anything half an hour to an hour is medium, and anything over an hour is long. But that's just me. The next way you can measure it is by the number of rounds. Normally combats end partway through their final rounds. This is usually a fraction, but you get the point. The number of full cycles of the initiative that you go through before the combat ends. Now, this is strongly correlated with the amount of time things take in character. Most RPG combat rounds are something like 5 or 6 seconds. Some are longer, like in RuneQuest where it's 12 seconds, or shorter, like in Cyberpunk where it's 3, or GURPS where it's 1. You take how many rounds you go through, multiplied by the number of seconds each round takes, and that's the amount of in-character time it took. My personal feeling on this is that 1 to 2 rounds is short, 3 to 5 is medium, and anything 6 and above is a long combat. But again, your mileage may vary. And finally, we have subjective time. How long or short the combat actually feels. As you can imagine, a slow combat feels sluggish, it's difficult to pay attention to, and you just start counting the minutes until your turn comes around again. A quick combat, on the other hand, feels intense. Stuff is happening all of the time, you are completely alert, excited, your heart is racing, everything's amazing. And a medium combat is somewhere between the two. You're able to pay adequate attention and things seem to happen at what feels like a reasonable pace, but there's no particular excitement to it. Like I said, this is a subjective metric, but when we talk about things that are and aren't fun, well, our sense of subjective time in combat is part of what contributes to that. I've often said that Cyberpunk Red has the fastest 2-hour combats of any RPG I've ever played, because while fights can run a really long time, there is always something happening. Characters are always moving around trying to get better range, better position, better angle around cover, and because turns themselves are fairly quick, you're always moving from person to person at a breakneck pace. So while in number of rounds or absolute time it can be very slow, in subjective time it can feel quick. D&D 5e, on the other hand, routinely gives me 2-3 round combats that take over half an hour and that feel remarkably languid. So yes, subjective time is important and it is subjective. But to understand the qualities of short and long combats better, let's do some pros and cons for each. Starting with short combats, they just feel faster, more action-packed, more cinematic. While there are genuine benefits to having high crunch for combat, there's nothing that quite beats the feel of racing through turns round and round and round, that something new is always happening right around the corner. And beyond that, as I said, they make the sessions and the campaigns themselves feel faster. I'm someone who likes quick combats, not because I hate combat, but because I usually want more than one in a session. I would generally say that 2 is ideal, 3 is a bonus. 1 is fine either if we've been doing a lot of roleplay or if it's a massive boss fight. But if a single fight with goblins is taking the entire session, I'm going to get annoyed. That being said, not everyone likes combat. And if you don't like combat, but for some reason you still have it in your campaign, well, getting it over and done with is the best thing you can do. As I said, if combats are quicker, you spend less time waiting for your turn. And so you get to feel like you're doing more, which is always a good thing. And finally, assuming the PCs win, shorter combats will make them feel competent. A lot of modern RPGs do seem to be heading further and further towards the power fantasy direction. And if you want to achieve that, well, having the players trounce their enemies in a matter of combat rounds will make them feel invincible. But for every silver lining, there is a cloud. short combats do have their problems. While trouncing a bunch of bandits in a single round might make the players feel incredibly powerful, trouncing the big bad evil guy of the campaign in a single round will just feel anticlimactic. There really are some fights that you just want to savor, that you actually want to feel the back and forth, and if you don't get that, that can be frustrating. And speaking of savoring combats, if you want to get through them quickly, it usually means giving very little description or no description at all. Just saying, yeah, you rolled a hit, yes, you hit, 18 damage, okay, that's your turn, next player. That is boring, tedious, mind-numbing, but it's also bloody quick. And speaking of making combats less fun at the expense of speed, if as a GM you want a quick combat, you generally have to use fewer enemies and fewer varieties of enemy. And again, that will strip the soul right out of your combat. To go a level further with the soullessness, the fastest RPG combat systems are generally very streamlined. But that means that they have to cut a lot out of the rule set. Interesting action and maneuver options? No. Detailed rules for damage, hit location, critical injury, status effects that add variety and dynamism to combat? No. I think the most basic example of this that I can give is actually Call of Cthulhu's initiative system. As I said earlier, initiative is fixed based on a character's dexterity score. And when I ran a 2-shot of Call of Cthulhu for a couple of my players last year, I found that getting combat started was very quick. No rolling, no tabulating. I had the character's dexes pre-prepared, so I could just start shouting out turns the moment a fight began. But I actually didn't enjoy that. I found it very flat and very predictable. And more than anything, that time spent rolling and tabulating initiative is a great moment to build up anticipation for a combat. Just leaping straight into a fight felt wrong to me on some level. And finally, if you ever try to shorten a combat, say trying to rush it to fit into the end of a session, well, that will just feel like the wrong kind of fast-paced. Rather than having the time to think and describe things, you will just end up feeling rushed and stressed, and no one wants to feel like that. But what about long combats, I hear you ask? Well, spending longer in combats can make them more memorable. The more time you spend doing something, the more chances there are that your brain will go, I should remember this. And on some level, tabletop RPGs are all about making stories and memories. So a long combat is one way to do that. And this is also why for a big boss fight or some other big set piece, a long combat is just more satisfying. Rather than a sudden damp squib that ends halfway through the second round, you have minute after minute of anticipation, of excitement, of finally getting to use all of your abilities and to see the enemies use all of theirs. That is where long combats come to life. The best example that I have of this comes from a mini-boss fight that I had in my last D&D campaign. The setup was that the PCs were heading towards the tomb of the evil undead lord who was trying to reconquer the local region, but to get to him they had to clear a mining camp full of undead that was blocking the entrance to his tomb. Now, I will put the map that I made for this up on slide, so that you can all get a nice good look at what's going on here. First off, surrounding the encampment, we have a massive spiked ditch. Falling into this would cause you 2d10 piercing plus 1d6 bludgeoning damage, as this meme one of my players made will now demonstrate. If you didn't feel like braving that DC 10 athletics check, well, you could theoretically go across the small wooden bridge, unless you were my players who decided to set it on fire in the first round of combat. Further on in, we have my favorite feature, the Archer Towers, raised 15 feet up off the ground, so that the skeletons inside could snipe away at the support characters to their heart's content. The result of this here setup was one of the longest, most tactical combats that I have ever had. It took us about 3 hours and we had to double the length of our session just to get through it all. And that was with us rushing towards the end. The players had to take plenty of time before the combat to actually strategize, to make a plan. Then they had to see it through, and players being players, they screwed up their own plans and had to start adapting on the fly. Especially once they realized how difficult that bloody ditch was to cross. And by the end of the combat, the cleric was completely out of spell slots, most of the PCs were dangerously close to 0 HP, and everybody's hearts were beating at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It was truly, truly epic, and I'm glad we gave it as much time as we did. And speaking of that, long combats make the NPCs feel more competent. One anecdote I heard that I can't verify is that when they were developing the original Halo video game, they found that if they gave the Covenant NPCs more health, playtesters thought the AI was smarter, because apparently our lizard brains think dumb thing die quick, smart thing die slow. This is really a topic that needs its own video, but smart, powerful villains in a tabletop RPG massively improve the experience. My first campaign, Curse of Strahd, that I don't stop talking about on this channel, well, we had quite a powerful main antagonist, and the constant menace that he was able to exude upon the players really did set the tone for the entire campaign, and really did contribute to my players' enjoyment of it. So yes, you do want your NPCs to feel competent and powerful, and in order to do that, your NPCs need to have at least some staying power in combat. And if they have staying power in combat, well, combat is going to take longer. If you want proof of the opposite, well, that campaign had just the right moment. To set the scene, the players had been exploring a long-abandoned wizard tower. They'd done their exploring, they'd made it up to the top floor, they found basically everything, and they were about to head out to explore the rest of Barovia. And then some werewolves happened, bounding across the causeway that connected the island the tower was on to the Barovian mainland. The werewolves charged forth and tried to attack the players. The players so utterly humiliated the werewolves in the first round of combat that by the final initiative, there were only 2 of them left. At which point the final action of that combat was for one of the player characters to ask those 2 remaining werewolves if they wanted to surrender, to which the werewolves promptly said yes. Now, my players were on one hell of an adrenaline high by the end of that combat. It was short, it was sharp, and it was utterly one-sided. And for the rest of that campaign, not a single one of my players had a single ounce of respect for any werewolf or any mention thereof. Perhaps what I should have done is pack in more enemies, just add 2, 3, 4, 10 more werewolves. Because if you're allowing yourself longer combat, you really can pack in the swarms of enemies. Obviously, it will lower the percentage of time that the players are interacting with the game if the GM is just going NPC, 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 occasionally player, NPC, NPC, occasionally player. But if you're willing to take time with the combats, you can take at least some liberties with this. And you know what? Swarms of NPCs can be fun to drown your players in. Faced with that, the players could always, do some strategizing, think, plan, crack some jokes, have some table banter. Again, when you give yourself time to actually let combats play through, you can do more description, more role-playing, spend more time thinking and deciding on tactics, and even have more room for table banter. Last but not least, long combats give the opportunity for crunchy mechanics. And in combat, that can be rather enjoyable. Having lots of little bells and whistles to play with is quite a bit of fun. You can go too far, of course. In my opinion, high-level D&D is horrendously bloated, and my one experience of it was more than enough to repel me from it for life. But if a game is designed well, and the mechanical crunch actually contributes positively to the gameplay experience, well, it's worth taking some time for. And for those of you role-playing crowd who seem to think that mechanics and roleplay are some oppositional force, I raise you Burning Wheel. That game is horrifically mechanically complicated, extremely difficult to learn and to run. Oh boy, is it rewarding when you finally figure out how the bloody fight rules work. But before I get accused of droning on about how amazing long combats are, there are some serious downsides. First and foremost is boredom. Long combats can be very boring. If you're sat around waiting for your turn, if you've reached that point on the subjective timescale where seconds feel like hours, then suddenly all of that additional role-playing and crunch just seems like it's meant to increase your suffering. Long combats can also just dominate a session, leaving little time for anything else. As I said, I like having 2 combats per session. Not every session. I do like having downtime sessions with no combat, same for RP exploration sessions. But if I'm going to have combat happen, I want it to happen more than once. And if you have long, detailed combat rules, that isn't necessarily possible. In fact, sometimes combats take longer than a session, as happened with Burning Wheel, where our attempt at the fight rules took us a session and a half. You know how I said that rushing combats just to try and get them finished really isn't fun? Well, with a long, complex combat system, that can be necessary if everyone wants to get home from the session on time. And while, as I said, long combats with powerful enemies can make them feel more threatening and thus, more impressive, more fun to fight, A long combat with a minor enemy is just humiliating and demoralizing. There is nothing fun about taking 8 rounds to beat a bunch of skeletons. Okay, sometimes it's fun. Sometimes there is just a sheer dark hilarity to everybody whiffing their attacks for round after round. But past a certain point, even that gets tedious. And finally, if your combats are taking a long time, it usually isn't because you're doing lots of roleplay or because you have a deep, crunchy system. It's usually because something about the way you're doing combats is hopelessly inefficient, and long combats are just a symptom of a much gnarlier problem. But what might those problems be? Well, the first one is not knowing the rules. If the rules are simple, or everybody knows them, getting through rule systems, no matter how complex, is actually pretty quick. But as soon as somebody doesn't know a rule, everything grinds to a halt, and you have a rather unpleasant dilemma. You can either slow the game down to look things up in the rulebook, however long it takes to find the page, read it out, debate what the wording means, all of that. Or you can make an on-the-fly ruling and potentially get things wrong, maybe even needing to correct yourself later, leading to inconsistency in the rules and in the game, making everything less pleasant. This is also why combats will inevitably take longer when you're playing a game system for the first time, simply because you'll just have more to look up than you would once you've got, 10, 15, 20 sessions under your belt. The second source of inefficiency is lack of player focus or decisiveness. Both of these contribute to slow combats. If a player is on their phone, checking email, whatever, during combat, and they don't respond immediately when their turn is called, that will slow things down. If they can't quite decide what the hell they're going to do with their turn, that again will slow things down. I am very willing to get up my player's grill about this and to keep calling their name over and over until they respond. And if I think they're taking too long to decide their actions, I will just start counting down from 10. If I reach 1 before they decide something, well, their turn ends and I'm moving them along. Speaking of players being distracted, chatter at the table, again, can slow things down. This can be anything from cracking jokes, deciding strategy, to... We once had a player join our Over the Edge campaign who just seemed to take no interest in what was happening in the actual RPG and kept trying to make small talk with all the other players, which was ungodly annoying. And while adding narrative and description to combat is an important part of making it feel cinematic, enjoyable, exciting, if the narration of combat encounters is persistently delayed by the egregious overuse of pleonastic grandiloquent verbiage in a long meandering sequence of superfluous syllables, well, now you're taking double the time for half the fun. In many cases, there are steps you can take to reduce the amount of inefficiency in your combats and to actually get things to a more enjoyable pace. Even if you like long combats, getting rid of the actual messy, inefficient parts will still improve your enjoyment of those combats. As I said, the longer you have to learn the rules, the less you'll have to look up. The more that you actually manage to crack down on distraction, the tighter, more focused, more engaging your combat will be. But you will eventually hit a point where more efficiency won't equal more fun. Again, just announcing attack and damage numbers is very efficient, but it also makes combat bland. Likewise, getting rid of table banter makes combat hyper efficient. It will run like a Swiss train schedule. But if you and your players aren't getting to crack jokes together, a lot of the camaraderie at the table will just fizzle away. So while you should make your combats efficient, you should only do it up to a point. Editing Sasho here, one tip that I forgot to mention for making your games more efficient, especially when you're playing in person, is if you're playing an RPG where attack and damage rolls are separate, roll them both at the same time. If you hit, you already have the damage rolled, which saves you an extra step in the order of operations, and if you miss, well, it doesn't really matter. Nice and easy. And so we come to my conclusion. How long should combat take? On some level, the answer is as long as you need it to, but not a second longer. There are genuine benefits to having combat go quickly, and not everyone who complains about combat taking too long is just doing it because they hate combat. On the other hand, combat exists to be fun, and in order to actually get that fun, you'll need to actually take time to go through the details. So go forth, cut out the moments of wasted time in your games, but never, ever, ever cut the heart out of them. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. How long do you think combat should be, and what should you be spending most of your time on? If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. I am trying to hit 1,000 subs, and while I'm a long way from it, the channel is growing fast, so here's hoping. Normally in this final section of the video, I'd give a pithy line about whatever I'm doing after recording. But now that my Pathfinder game has A, started, and B, gone from fortnightly to weekly, well, that's going to be the same every week. Which means I think that for now I'm going to retire this section of the outro. And on that terrible disappointment, I'd like to once more thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.